So first of all, a very, very warm welcome to everyone on behalf both of the Czech Centre London and of Insiders Outsiders, of which I'm the director. Some of you may know Insiders Outsiders was a project started some while ago, a year-long nationwide festival in the first instance, intended to celebrate and pay tribute to the tremendous contribution to British culture of those who fled here from Nazi-dominated Europe. But I think it's completely appropriate that in this week of all weeks, which coincides, of course, with Holocaust Memorial Day, that we take pause to remind ourselves, if we really do need reminding, that for every story of achievement and contribution of those who did come to the safety, who made it to the safety of this country, there's a backdrop of tremendous and indeed deeply traumatic loss, particularly, of course, in this historical context, due to the horrors of the Holocaust. It is, as you know, and on the 27th, it is Holocaust Memorial Day. There's a tremendous amount this week competing, I think, for our attention, but I'm willing to bet that you'll agree with me by the end of the session tonight that this will be a most memorable and, well, you know, heartbreaking but wonderful, rich, densely rewarding event, even, you know, when there is so much vying for our attention. So let me just stop myself getting too emotional there by just reminding you of some very basic housekeeping rules. I'm sure you by now are over familiar with all this, but I have already put in the chat that I would very much appreciate, we would very much appreciate it if you keep yourselves both invisible and inaudible at all times, just to avoid any noise or visual interference from everybody. We've got a tremendous number of people, over 300, I believe, originally signed up for the event, and people are still coming in. So I would very much appreciate it if you could just remember that. There will be, of course, an opportunity later to respond to what's being said on screen with your questions and comments through the chat function. Again, I'm sure this is all very familiar to you. Address your questions just to me, Monica BOHM-DUCHEN, if you wouldn't mind. An alternative is to use something called Slido, which will be familiar to many of you. I must confess I'd not come across it until recently, and I will actually put the link, the website link on chat in a minute, using the hashtag #NoNightSoDark. So there are two ways of fielding your questions, sort of getting your questions to me. Right, I think without further ado, I'd like to introduce the main force, if you like, the kind of mover and shaker behind this event, namely David Vaughan, who in turn will introduce the other participants. So David Vaughan is a Prague-based writer, broadcaster, journalist, and university lecturer. His debut novel, which I won't attempt to pronounce in Czech, was first published in 2014. It won the Czech Book Prize Award in 2015 and has been translated into English by Janta Publishing as Hear My Voice several years later, in fact, just in 2019. It looks extremely interesting. I ordered it immediately on Amazon when I heard about it myself, and I look forward to reading it. He's also the author of a study called The Battle for the Airwaves, 2008, a study of the role of the media in the run-up to World War II. And for 8 years, he was editor-in-chief of Radio Prague, having previously been the BBC's Prague correspondent. So he knows the Czech Republic and Czech history intimately, as you will realize from that description. So over to you, David, with great pleasure.
Hello, I hope you can all see me. Thank you enormously, Monica, for those words of introduction. I think it does promise to be a very moving occasion. We're going to be meeting a quite remarkable family, and I'm here in Prague. People are joining us from all over the world. Thanks not just to Monica and to the festival and project Insiders Outsiders, but also to the Czech Centre in London, who are hosting this event as well. The Wels family achieved a remarkable amount over the last 200 years, an immense diversity. And so really to start with, I thought we need to introduce the family in all their diversity. And the way I'm going to do that is by playing a short introduction to the family, which we pre-recorded with the Czech-British actress Veronika Hicks, or Hickshova. And so I shall now do our first little technical experiment. This is basically a beginner's introduction to this remarkable family.
In 1838, the young Josefina Löwy set out on foot on a journey of nearly 200 miles in search of Count Caspar Sternberg. Only he had the authority to grant her a permit to marry her beloved Bernard. Jews in Bohemia and Moravia were only allowed to marry according to rules that were precisely defined by the so-called Familiant laws. It was only thanks to Josefina's stubbornness that all the subsequent generations of the Wels family were to see the light of day. Josefina's adventurous journey is one of many episodes described by her son Szymon Wels in his memoir. He completed the book in 1919, and it captures the atmosphere of the West Bohemian countryside in the 19th century with a light touch full of humour and tenderness, although Szymon was not a man to suffer fools gladly. He had a small shop on the village green in Ossek, and his family had been living in the village for many generations. In 1907, Szymon's first son Rudolf was admitted to the Academy of Arts in Vienna, where he studied architecture. There, in the years just before World War I, he became a student and then a colleague of the legendary Adolf Loos. Rudolf went on to design many buildings in Czechoslovakia between the wars. They reflect a strong sense of space that he shared with Loos, a feeling for detail and material, and a strong belief shared with his father Szymon and his grandmother Josefina that it was possible to make the world a better place. Rudolf's career and happy family life in Karlovy Vary and then in Prague were brought to a violent end when German troops marched into Prague in 1939. With the introduction of the Nuremberg racial laws and increasingly petty and humiliating restrictions, the family's world became ever smaller. Rudolf, his wife Ida, and their younger son Martin were sent to the Terezin ghetto and then to Auschwitz, where they were murdered in March 1944. Just before they were deported, they left their most treasured possessions in a box with friends, the family of the Protestant pastor, Josef Stifter, as well as hundreds of letters, documents and photographs, and the manuscript of Szymon's memoir. They included a richly illustrated little typewritten book with the title Sancta Familia, which Martin and his older brother Tomáš had put together for their parents and grandmother for Christmas 1938. It was made up of humorous scenes from the daily life of the family. By a small miracle, the box survived, even though the apartment block where the Stifters lived received a direct hit during an Allied bombing raid in February 1945. 18-year-old Tomáš succeeded in fleeing to Great Britain just after the beginning of the occupation. He served in the Royal Air Force and married an Englishwoman, Joy. Tomáš returned briefly to Prague just after the war and quickly discovered that his parents and brother had perished. He visited the Stifters and returned to Britain with as many of the family things as he could carry. They ended up at the back of a cupboard in his house. Tomáš never talked to his 3 children about his family's past, but he was careful to preserve the box containing everything he had brought from Czechoslovakia. And this is where another long family journey begins. Nearly 4 decades later, Tomáš had a stroke, and his son Colin decided to reopen the box.
Thanks very much to Veronika Hicks, for recording that. She recorded it, in fact, in France, so we really are all over the world. I'd like now for Colin Wels and Gerry Turner to join me. If you could unmute yourselves and put on your video, we could begin a discussion, really picking up where, I don't know where Gerry is. I hope we'll see him soon.
Well, you should see me now.
I see you now, indeed, Gerry. I see you very well. Really, I'd like to pick up the story where Veronica left it there, that Colin, your father had a stroke, and just when he was planning to tell you his family's story, he couldn't. What happened then?
Well, he went for a heart operation, and we visited him in hospital, and he said, well, and all our lives, really, he had said very, very little about his past. I got more from my mother than I got from my father. And when we visited him in the hospital, a very serious operation, he said, I must tell you all about my family. And he was coming to visit us the following Monday, and that was a Thursday. But between the Thursday and the Monday, he had a very severe stroke and never spoke again. So he was living in Oxford. We went to Oxford and got his possessions, and there among the possessions was the contents of this box, which had lived in a cupboard in our house for many years. And as very small children, we used to meddle in the cupboard and see these things, but they meant absolutely nothing. And even when we recovered them from Oxford, they still meant nothing, because they're all in Czech and German, and we didn't speak that. So.
And your father had quite literally told you nothing about his past before he came to Britain?
So very little, so very little. Well, interestingly, he'd said things like, I don't speak any Czech, I only speak German, which we thought was very strange, because he lived in Czechoslovakia. And it's odd little things like that I remember, but nothing very substantive at all about the family.
Of course, he did speak Czech. He spoke fluent Czech. It was his native tongue, one of his native tongues. And I mean, this is really where Gerry comes into the story, because you had all this material which you couldn't understand because it was all in either Czech or German. And where did Gerry come into the story?
Well, we looked through this stuff, and we found this particular book that you've already seen a picture of, Ubernatu.
And that's the original manuscript you have there.
It is the original manuscript, yes. It's all in handwritten stuff. And my then wife was walking in Hemel Hempstead one day and bumped into Gerry and said, oh, interesting, Gerry, because don't you speak Czech? Because we've got this book and we don't know what on earth it is. And Gerry said, oh yeah, I'll sort of have a look. I'm quite busy, but I'll find some time for you to have a look.
Let's get Gerry to pick up the story. Let's get Gerry to pick up the story here.
Well, I'd come across.
You're muted, Gerry.
Oh, sorry. I'd come across Colin in the Woodcraft Folk, which is because his daughter was one of the children attending, and that's why his wife recognised me on the street. I didn't recognise her. That was the problem at that moment. I wasn't quite sure who I was talking to, and then she mentioned Colin, and then oh yes, in Czech, and I thought, well, yeah, so family accounts, how fascinating, and thought no more about it really, until I needed to borrow a printer to print some stuff out, and I knew that Colin was a software author, and I tried him, and he with alacrity said, no problem, I'll bring it over, and I'll bring over this manuscript at the same time. It just happened to be the first one, just early Christmas, early weeks before Christmas. so Colin came over with this incredible box of the treasures. Well, he didn't come with the box, he came with the manuscript.
And it was just serendipity, wasn't it? That you happened to speak Czech, you happened to be married to a Czech.
Well, we'll come to that in a minute again, because my wife, who was baking cookies, being a Czech at that time, was baking cookies for Christmas and wasn't over pleased at having a visit around this time, which is totally taboo. But nonetheless, she joined us with coffee and her first cookies. And she idly opened the book and started to read it, and then suddenly went, "I was born here." And she discovered that the book, which starts with the words "I was the
second paragraph.
Yes, yes, the first paragraph, in a little room in house number 15 in Osijek on the first floor on the 20th of April 1853 in the evening, I first saw the light of a little oil lamp. And my wife said, "Osijek, well, that's about 5 miles from where I was born. And we may be a small country or a small province of Bohemia, but nonetheless, the coincidence was so extreme that, of course, she said, 'Leave it here, please, I want to read it.' And we spent the evening reading the manuscript. And her immediate thought was, to take it back with her to Prague when she visited her mother. And we had the whole manuscript photocopied, and she took it off to Prague. Because she happened to be a close friend of Zbigniew Hader, the poet, she took it to show him, and he sort of had the same sort of reaction that I had that time. He said, "Oh yes, well, it's interesting. I'll leave it here, and I'll have a look." And I think almost probably the following day, he said, "I want to publish it. It's beautiful." And so the photocopy stayed with Zbigniew, and back in Ireland, where we were living at the time, we received in the following year a postcard, a very laconic postcard from Zbigniew, which of course wasn't signed Zbigniew Hader, just Z, saying Shimon's baby is born, is in the world. So we knew that it had come out as a samizdat edition in a collection. Well, he was one of the editors of a very interesting samizdat edition of books about, mostly historical books about Central Europe.
And you've got a copy of the book there. If you could hold it up maybe and show it to us.
I have indeed, and that is it as it came out, exactly. And I'm grateful to Barbara. Hello, Barbara. I know you're watching us. Thank you so much for.
It's a beautiful edition as well. And I'd like to come back to Colin, because
because you spoke about the coincidence, can I just read that short section from Zbigniew?
Yes, that little paragraph.
Afterword, which I think is, I just read again this evening and just made a quick translation of it, where he says, "Perhaps the most remarkable circumstance surrounding this book is that the English Welses in a small town near London happened to encounter strangers who happened to speak Czech. And perhaps that chance encounter sparked their curiosity, not having previously attempted to decipher their family heirloom, which led them to ask whether the Turners," he didn't write Turners, he wrote T-S, "might like to take a look at the manuscript. Thus, by coincidence," he wrote in inverted commas, "this remarkable book of reminiscences is emerging from oblivion."
Emerging from Hemel Hempstead. And not only that, you also, Gerry, very importantly, you translated the book. And I'd like to go back to Colin, because this was your first step back into your family's past. Because once Gerry had translated your grandfather's, your great-grandfather's remarkable memoir, suddenly you had a way into the past of your family.
Indeed. Well, it's so much a mystery, and it's still unfurling now, because every time anybody does anything with it, more and more and more information comes out. But yeah, it is just and such a rich history. I never realized that. I, just grew up thinking just a fairly ordinary sort of immigrant history, but of course found out much more about it than that. Yeah.
And after the fall of communism, you went back to, well, you came to Czechoslovakia, and you actually went to Osek, to the village where your family has its roots. But I remember you telling me that you didn't feel it was part of your own story.
No, it didn't. It did. No, it was somebody else's story, really. I mean, I felt no sort of connection to it, except through what I'd learnt about the family. Yeah, it was strange. Yes.
Do you feel gradually that you have reconnected with your family's past?
Yes.
Strange?
I think the having visited Czech Republic so many times now, and seen various people that had known about my grandfather and family, I feel much more connected to it now. I feel very proud, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to give everybody a taste of Ubernatu, which is the title of the book, which means life at the Bernards, which is derived from your great-grandfather's name, Bernard. I've put together a little collage of extracts from the book, which form part of a podcast, which we're just completing at the moment. And so I'm going to play you now this collage of bits and pieces from Ubernatu, from the book, read by Gordon Truefit. Bear with me.
How I came to tell this story, at the request of my children, Rudolf and Inka and Otto. I sat down one quiet evening and started sorting through the memories of my own life and the life of my parents. I wrote down these fragments on scraps of paper or on clean pages torn out of my children's old exercise books. And one incident in my memory would call forth the one before and the one after. In just a few weeks, there was already a good handful of such scraps. I sought among these memories, as one does when raking over the dying embers in a stove, and I observed just how eventful and interesting can be the life of even the least and most lowly of human beings. My parents were very devout, and Papa was well versed in the law. He could spend hours with Mama and me in contemplation of the Holy Scripture. And since he also enjoyed discoursing with Christians, he had a good knowledge of the New Testament too. His friends would often tell him what the Father had said in his sermon, and whenever there seemed anything not quite right about it, or if he thought the priest was mistaken, he would take down his copy of the New Testament and look it up for himself. We kept the religious festivals in proper style. Our favourite as children was Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, which we called Under the Greenery. We set off one Sunday in July 1889 at 5 in the morning, and in 3 hours we had covered the distance of 11 kilometres. It was worth coming to see. The immense weight of the iron construction, complete with track, started to shift from one bank to the other in total silence. I was standing in about the third row from the front, and all of a sudden the little lad broke away from me and wormed his way through to the front in order to get a better view. But he was unable to keep his balance there on the edge of the chasm and hurtled downwards. We watched in horror as he went head over heels down the sheer slope towards the river. I gripped the person next to me and shut my eyes so as not to see him hit the bottom of the gorge. Then, as if in a dream, I heard a cry. "The bush has broken his fall." I ran down to the river by the roundabout path in the company of several others. Little Rudolph was just picking himself up. Nothing at all had happened to him. I took him by the hand and we scrambled back up, helping each other. Back at the top, one woman said to him, "Oh, you confounded little whippersnapper! I could already see your daddy gathering up your little bones into his hanky." "You little scallywag," another woman burst in. "I still haven't got over it yet."
So there we have it, an extract from, or several extracts, short extracts from Albert. It's lovely the way that his attitude towards the Catholic Church, his skepticism, is typical actually for Czechs in the second half of the 19th century. It's very, very amusing, and there's also that wonderful episode with his little boy Rudolf when he was about 4 or 5, going off to see the new bridge being built at Smedčice across the river Klabava, and I chose that particular bit not just because it's rather a lovely story, but also because this is an early interest that Rudolf is showing in building, and young Rudolf then went on to become a rather fine architect. I mean, Rudolf's childhood, Jerry, I know, have been fascinated by Rudolf's childhood and the way it's described in the story, in the book.
Yes, and thank you so much for getting that recorded by our old friend Gordon, because it's one of my favourite passages in the book, because I'm a bit of a railway freak anyway myself. And that was a joy to translate, as was the rest. The entire book was a total labour of love for me.
And Rudolf's child, I mean, Rudolf, when Szymon managed to get Rudolf into the Catholic school in Pilsen, didn't he, in Pilsen? And then
Yeah.
Not only that, but he had the cheek to take him out again from the Catholic school. It wasn't typical it was very unusual for a Jewish family to send their child to the Catholic school, and the brethren were upset, weren't they, when he decided that he wasn't getting a good enough education.
Well, I was translating the book in Ireland in 1988, and of course I was beginning to learn things about I'd only just moved to Ireland at that time. I was beginning to learn things about the Christian Brothers and the way that the Christian Brothers treated their pupils. And, well, wasn't the Christian Brothers in the case of James Joyce, but you got in Portrait of the Artist an idea of the way they treated him. And towards the end of Szymon's reminiscences is the story of how he went to Pilsen, and Rudolf was absolutely unhappy with the way he was being treated, and when he heard this, Szymon said, "No way, you're not staying here," and hauled him out. And enrolled him in the technical academy, the technical grammar school at that time, and hence he got his technical education.
And Colin, I mean, Szymon from the book and his family are immensely likable, aren't they? I mean, it's beautifully written, just the way that he sort of captures the character of all the members of the family, and it's sort of you feel drawn in as a member of the family, don't you, almost?
Well, that's right, and he has a tremendous sense of humour as well that comes through, and it is very, very readable as a history. Yes, indeed.
And I mean,
Well,
Did you want to say something, Gerald?
I was going to say, let's hope that the translation eventually gets published, and we've got lots of people watching this evening, and they might take that message back somewhere.
Yeah, I think that they definitely should. And I mean, we've got Rudolf. He's left school. He goes to Prague, where he becomes an apprentice builder. And I'm actually going to play us or show us some slides that take us through Rudolf's career as an architect, and we can maybe talk through them. Bear with me.
Gosh, and I'd no idea that he had passed this and been at some event in the Jerusalem synagogue, but I had no idea until last week that he had any connection with it at all.
Well, we don't know if he actually took part in it, but this building was designed by Wilhelm Šťastný, but it was built by the very well-known Prague builder Alois Richter, and Rudolf was doing an apprenticeship. Just at the beginning of the last century, an apprenticeship with Alois Richter. So he worked very closely with him. So it's probable that Rudolf, as a very young man, was involved in this building. That's the Jerusalem synagogue in the center of Prague. A rather wonderful sort of neo-Moresque building. Rudolf then got into the, in fact, it's not there. Rudolf then got into the academy in Vienna in 1907 to study architecture, having already had experience as a builder's apprentice. And it's exactly the same time as Adolf Hitler failed to get into the Vienna Academy, which is an interesting detail. Rudolf studied under Friedrich Aumann, and he was a very good student. He won a scholarship to go to Britain, where he studied the Garden City, and he wrote a little pamphlet called The Garden City Motion, he calls it. I think he meant movement.
The same word in Czech for motion and movement.
Exactly, so it's a mistranslation. And he came back, and it was to inspire him actually all through his life. He was very interested in the Garden City. He was also interested as a student, interestingly, in the Baroque, which was out of fashion at the time. But I think that's also explains to some extent that Baroque sense of space and of playing with space, which is something that Rudolf was very good at as an architect. These are some drawings that he did for Friedrich Aumann when he was still a student. He also did various designs even for Prague. These are plans for the Palacký quay embankment in the center of Prague. None of it was realized. He was still a student at the time. And well, he started working with none other than Adolf Loos. Initially he was going to Adolf Loos's informal architecture school, and then he was actually taken on as his assistant. The head of his building office. Sorry, Jerry.
I just wonder whether those watching us will be familiar with Loos.
I mean, Loos is, yeah, he's really one of the most influential architects of the first half of the 20th century. He was famous for his essay rejecting decoration, rejecting ornament, and also for his conviction that it was important to design not through plans and sections, but in 3 dimensions, which the idea of the Raumplan, which is an idea that Rudolf very much took on, and also Adolf Loos was really at the very heart of sort of cultural life in Vienna at the time. So Rudolf had gone from rural Bohemia into this very cosmopolitan world. And this is a sketch he did for an unrealized building. His sketches are wonderful. This is in Alexandria, a department store that was never built. And Adolf Loos liked this sketch so much that he had it in his living room at home. In fact, it still hangs there. And Rudolf was sent to the front. He came back, and in 1917 he survived. He was injured, which was lucky because he didn't have to go back again. Luckily, he wasn't too seriously injured. This particular project from 1917 is from when he came back to Vienna, and it's a very utopian garden city for children, which includes, for example, a Catholic church, a Protestant church, and this particular picture shows the synagogue. And I think it very much emerged from his experiences at the front. There's another interior. Wonderful, wonderful drawings as well. It's quite Otto Wagner as well. Then we get to Czechoslovakia, and I would like it if Colin's brother Ivan can join us as well. Ivan, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Is another grandson of Rudolf Wels, and I've chosen this particular building to show a picture of. So I know it's one of Colin's favorites. This is the school, originally the German grammar school in Sokolov, originally Falkenov in Western Bohemia, where Rudolf built many of his first buildings, his earliest buildings in Czechoslovakia. He became very successful very quickly. Here is again a garden city inspired housing estate that was built in Falkenov at the time, in the early 20s. And then this building is the building for which Rudolf Wels is most famous. It was completed in 1925, and it's the Hornický dům, the miner's house in Sokolov. And interestingly, Rudolf also designed the frieze, a day in the life of a miner. Here is a section, you can see elements of the Raumplan, of this playing with different levels in the building. It's wheelchair access is a disaster in this building, but it is very interesting in terms of the different levels. I'm going to ask Ivan to explain this next photo.
Right, this is the first time I saw Hornický dům. When we went across, we were doing the opening ceremony that Michael Rundt, I think, organised. And we just didn't know, well, I didn't know, Colin might have done, I didn't know that he did anything this grand. The scale of it is just immense. The colour is incredible because it's an uncompromising pink, which I think was painted grey during the Soviet era. But it is just absolutely gobsmacking. I think if I could just say that in our family, the dynamics were that my mother, Colin might disagree with this, but my mother was a dominant one, and my father was a quieter man and was much more in the background and didn't push himself forward. My mother was very dominant. So all this has been covered with layers of family history. So seeing it now, and even now, still uncovering layer after layer. I didn't even know that Rudolf, for instance, and the family ended up in Auschwitz. I knew they went to a concentration camp, but I didn't know it was Auschwitz. So even now we're uncovering layers. So the fact that this was so early on in his career is absolutely amazing. And as I say, you can't tell, if you look at the people in the doorway there, in the portico, you can see how small they are, because it is absolutely enormous. The actual frieze at the top there is about 8 foot high, or 2.5 meters. And I'm still, even today, just amazed at how much he actually did. He was obviously a very, very busy man.
And you were invited to the opening of the freshly renovated miner's house. This was in 2006, I think. Really, we have to mention a man called Michael Rundt, who I hope is with us today, who really is the director of the local museum in Sokolov, and he was really the driving force behind reviving memory of Rudolf Wels in Sokolov, and he also became a good friend of yours.
Well, don't forget his father, also Jan Rund.
Yes, and his father. Ivan.
Yes, yes, I didn't know, for instance, that Jan was involved with the renovation, because I think it was neglected over the years, and just left to shambles inside. I mean, I might be wrong about that, but obviously there's a lot of building work being done downstairs, and then gradually over the years it's been renovated throughout. But it's just the scale of it. Now, when I first went across, it was to open the Hornicki Dome again, or rededicate it. If you look at the, there's a red spot just to the left of the building. Underneath that, there's a plaque which has a bas relief of Rudolf himself. And Mikhail had actually made a book based on the architecture of Rudolf, and he was going to dedicate the book the following day or the day after. That's it. That's the book. According to a Czech custom, pouring champagne on it, I think.
That's right.
and dedicating it. So I had to go to with Colin to that plaque, and we made a speech. Well, I made a speech, which Jerry translated at the time. And I started off by saying, for us, Rudolf was just a ghost in the background. He was there. You could see the drawings that he did behind Colin, the posters, and behind me as well. We saw those. We saw one or two sketchbooks. That was it. So I said it, and this is bringing it all to life again. Even though, certain evil people try to submerge it and get it wiped off the face of the earth, nevertheless, here it is in its glory, and he's coming to life again. So it's a wonderful rediscovery again.
We've got a lot of ground to cover, so if anybody wants to sort of ask questions and to bring up and to ask further questions about any of the points that we've been talking about, it'd be great if we can come back to them at the end. In the meantime, I'm going to show a few more photographs of some of Rudolf's buildings. Not only did he design buildings, but he also designed glass. This is for the famous Moser factory manufactory in Carlsbad in Karlovy Vary. I think, Colin, you've actually got next to you have a vase designed by Rudolf from the Animal series. It's got the fish on it. This one has birds. Here are elephants. This is a treasured item, I think, Colin, isn't it, in your family history, which actually survived in Prague and ended up being returned to you by the granddaughter of the Protestant pastor with whom it stayed.
Yeah, that's
right.
right.
Watching us at the moment.
Sorry, what's that, Jerry?
Who I can report is watching us at the moment.
Who is watching us at the moment? Hello.
Yeah.
And we're going to have to go very quickly through the architecture. These are some of the buildings designed by Rudolf. This is in Carlsbad. This is a wonderful building, unfortunately demolished in 2006. It was already in very poor condition, again in Karlovy Vary in Carlsbad. This is the Jewish Old People's Home in Karlovy Vary, which has a very sort of Adolf Loosish sort of entrance. Unfortunately, it's recently had its windows all taken out and replaced by plastic ones, which have rather spoilt the look of the building, but it is still a very fine, impressive building. This is a masterpiece. Again in Karlovy Vary. This is the health insurance building. This is an article which is singing its praises from the time. And if you look at the top, I've got a bar in front of it, but maybe some of you can see it. Thomas, your father, is singing the praises at the age of 10. He's singing the praises of his father's building. And then there's this rather ecstatic article about it. That's the building as it looks now. It's been very sensitively renovated. He also designed the building next door, which we can see here. This is his first building in Prague, and it's also the building where the family lived. They had the top floor flat from 1935 onwards, and it's in Prague 7. That's the interior in its current state. It's quite neglected. And this is the Alpha passage, including a cinema. This is just off Wenceslas Square. And that was, it's interesting, by this stage, Rudolf had gone into partnership with another architect called Guido Lagus, who was very closely involved with the German emigre exile and literary community. And he was bringing out at the same time as working with Rudolf, he was also bringing out the foremost German literary exile magazine, a periodical, which was called Neue Deutsche Blätter. Fascinating.
David, while we're on the buildings, I want to finish this bit here. And
okay, should we just quickly go through this? And also with Lagus, with Guido Lagus, they also worked on films, and this is Voskovec and Verich, the famous actor and comedy duo in a film called Hey Rop, Heave Ho, which they acted as architects for it. And this is another film on which Lagus and Wels collaborated as architects, amazing interior. And they also designed a number of, in the 1930s, a number of...
Yes, come when we get to the next one, I'd like to mention something about it.
This one?
Yeah.
This building. This is a building in Veverkova Street, just round the corner from where I am now. Gerald, did you want to say something about it?
Well, Colin and I visited the flat together a few years ago, and there and the flats that he designed in Karlovy Vary, what I was impressed with was just the incredible practical use of the design of the interior space. Everything was thought of from the point of view of the user, and that is what is so astonishing about everything that he did. And Rudolf, designed everything down to the doorknobs. And just to be in them, and we spoke to the present residents, and they were so warm in their praise of how nice it was to live in these places. I'm thinking of the place I'm living at the moment, which has no storage space, and he thought of storage space.
I mean,
could I just say that I saw that and I wasn't very impressed, because it's quite modest. But every time I see it, I get more impressed by it, because it's got a calmness about it and a sort of measured quality, which I think probably goes with its character. It's not a sort of in-your-face exhibitionist sort of building showing off. It is very calm and sorted out, and it looks really nice.
Very high quality materials as well. And this is a typical sort of Adolf Loos type feature as well.
The portals are very interesting, and those portals are we find in most of his buildings, including the old people's home in Karlovy Vary. And I wonder whether, because he was looking at some of the ancient Jewish structures, and that's possibly a reflection of that.
This is, this particular building is also just 100 meters from, by awful irony, from the place where the family were held for 3 days before being sent to the Theresienstadt ghetto. So it's possible they even could see this building from where they were being kept, which is a horrible thought. Very quickly, that's another building in Prague. These are sketches, incredibly good sketches that Rudolf did during the war, after he was banned from working as an architect under the Nuremberg laws. And these are the Stolpersteine outside their flat in Dobrovského Street, marking.
Those drawings were made in order to actually make some money. He sold them, some of them. They tried to sell them at the time because they had no source of income.
I think the ones behind Colin and Ivan, I think, are also from that time. We need to move on. I'd like to talk as well about really about the family. We talked about Rudolf as an architect. We need to talk about Rudolf's family life. Again, we've got some amazing photographs. Nearly everything that we've seen has come from your boxes, your incredible boxes, which survived in Prague during the war, and which your father brought back to England, thank goodness, and preserved them. And among these things, there are the most beautiful family photographs. This is your grandfather Rudolf as a little boy. This is your great uncle, isn't it, Otto, as a little boy, and this is your great aunt Aninka. I don't have a picture of her when she's young. Again, that's Rudolf. That's Aninka as a young woman, and this is Otto. And well, you can tell us who that is sitting in front. Your grandmother.
Yeah, Ida.
Ida, who was from a very successful, wealthy Jewish family in Cheb, in Eger. Interestingly, her native tongue was German, and the native language of Shimon's family was Czech. Again, this is her in Egerland folk costume, which is interesting because it's normally associated with Sudeten Germans, and here's this Jewish family with the Egerland folk costume. Ida on the right and her brothers. You'll be able to tell me that a lot of, luckily, much of Ida's family survived, didn't they? They managed to get out in time, unlike Ida herself.
In fact, yes, most of them went to the States, in fact. And I hope some of our States cousins are there and will recognise their grandparents, basically. Just grandparents. I get confused with all the generations.
Yes, Ida and her younger sister Ilse.
So yeah, indeed.
Ilse.
Yeah.
And there's Rudolf and Ida just after they got married. Here's Ida as a nurse doing her sort of Sybil in Downton Abbey bit as a volunteer nurse at the beginning of World War I.
Well,
and this is a sorry, yes.
You mentioned, of course, that Rudolf got injured, and I wonder if that was where he met Ida when he was in hospital.
I think it's very likely. I mean, Michael Rund says that the families already knew each other, but I think it's very likely because he was in the right place at the right time in Cheb. And these pictures of your father and your uncle Rudolf.
Yeah.
It's worth pointing out, David, that by this time they were thoroughly secular, I suppose the term really, but they were anti-religious. My father, if he had strong views, he had strong views about religion. They didn't see themselves as Jewish. They called themselves Czech. If I said Jewish, he said, well, we're Czech. And that's how they always saw themselves. And I think that came from Rudolf. He is probably the first one, but it might have even come from before that, that they're moving away from that Jewish Orthodox atmosphere. So,
I mean, Shimon certainly wasn't anti-religious, Ivan.
No.
There was no way. I mean, he was
ecumenical, wasn't he?
Yes, he appreciated his father's devotion as a Jew, but clearly you're right that he was moving away from the Orthodox tradition.
Right. It's perhaps when it met my father. My father took up the I think, and he saw science as the answer to things, not religion.
Because don't forget, in Ubernato, in his reminiscences, he does quote from a something that he picked up in a Christian church, and he quotes it with approval.
Yeah,
it's very I think you can't simplify it. I think it's just very, very complex. The family's relationship to religion through the generations was very.
I think he was very much a humanist, and in every sense.
This, by the way, is Martin as a little boy drawing, and that's very relevant to the fact, of course, that he later created that wonderful book.
That's Carlo Vivari still.
That's Carlo Vivari, very bourgeois by then. You can see they're very successful, a successful architect. That's the family on holiday in Binz on Rügen in northern Germany. That's Tom, your father, as a very competent young man just before they moved to Prague. Here are the two boys having moved to Prague. They lived in Hans Paulka in a very nice flat before they moved to the flat that I showed a little earlier. There they are. Lovely photos. This one on the right is on the terrace of the flat in Dobrovského Street, again with Ida. And these are some of the very last photographs before the sort of maelstrom of the Second World War happened. This is Rudolf and Martin in Letnar Park, just where they lived in February 1938. And then this is Rudolf and Ida in the street, Národní třída. Rudolf is a successful architect. Tom looking like he's ready to leave home. I think your father was all set to leave home at that stage. And here's the last photograph, I think, of the three of them, of Tom, Ida, and Martin on the terrace of their house in Dobrovského Street. Again, this is less than a year before the occupation began, and your father fled to Britain. This is the awful letter from the American embassy rejecting their application for a visa in this horrible bureaucratic language. It is assumed that your turn might be reached within the next fiscal year. And this photograph is already from the time of the occupation. This is Martin exercising at the Hagibor Jewish sports ground during the war, before they were sent to town.
What makes me smile about that picture is that his mother, in his own account in Sancta Familia, is always chiding him for not doing enough exercise.
That he is. And this is the family, this is their friends, the Stifter family, it's a remarkable story because they became very close friends. Josef Stifter was a minister in the Unity of Czech Brethren. They actually joined the church, interestingly, from the point of view of their attitude towards religion. They joined the Unity of Czech Brethren already during the occupation, so there was probably many complex reasons probably for that. There's Rudolf Wels on the right, there's Ida Wels, and here's Martin on the left. And there's also a calendar, which I don't know if you can see it. I've got something in front of it, but there's a calendar just up here above. This is the daughter, Lydia, of
1941 on it.
Josef Stifter. You, in fact, Ivan and Colin, you met Lydia, didn't you?
Yes, we did. Yes. She died a few years ago. Yeah. But you were talking about the calendar on the wall there, David. There you go. Yeah, this is it.
This was drawn by Martin, and this was just a few months before they were sent to Terezin and then on to Auschwitz. This is your aunt, your great aunt, Eva. Sorry, this is Eva, your cousin, who was Aninka's daughter, and she perished also in the Holocaust along with her mother. And well, Colin, this is and Ivan, this is your father during the war as a soldier. He had this rather spectacular escape, didn't he, from in the spring of 1939, which he never told you about.
I think my mother told me a little bit about it, but she didn't go into detail. She said that he escaped from at the beginning of the war, and she said he escaped through Poland, but we didn't really have very much detail on it. So at the time,
until you opened the box.
Well, I think you've got to remember, in this box there's an enormous amount of material, and most of it in Czech and German, but interestingly some of it in English. And so we made a discovery about how he actually got out of Germany, sorry, out of Czechoslovakia, and escaped from the Nazis. Yeah.
We knew that he was in the RAF, didn't we? And in fact, he did talk about that every now and then. And he said how boring it was, just sitting in an office, just waiting for something to happen. He didn't actually sort of see active service in the RAF. But
Well, from what I understand, he was reluctant to join up because he was studying in Swansea and no wish to interrupt his studies at that moment.
Well, and he was juggling all sorts of activities as well. I think one of the jobs he did was bottle washing or something, and he used to do that at nights while he was studying during the day and so on.
But he was also married, and he also got married. I mean, and here here you are, Ivan.
Yes, and he's an arts corporal, corporal. So I mean, he must have done something, you know. But he just disliked the whole life in the RAF and said how boring it was. So
well, he used to tell me that he was a cook in the Czech branch of the RAF.
That's possible. Yeah,
I just don't know. He said so little. Yeah.
Here he is with your mother, Joy.
Yeah.
The,
and here he is as an older man. And
that's just before he had his stroke. That is not long before. I decided to take some photographs of them all, and that's the one I took of him.
And here he is. This is lovely, isn't it? Because his grandson is called Simon, and of course his grandfather was also called Shimon. So there's a nice bit of serendipity again.
But you had no idea, had you, Ivan, that your great-grandfather was named Shimon at all?
It was just a name which ran around the family. You know, families have names that sort of come along, and Simon. I think Colin. Well, it's Colin Simon Wells. So I mean, you know, it's sort of a name that was around, but never actually. No one actually had the name. But that's great grandfather, isn't it? Shimon is
yes. Well, Simon's great grandfather.
Great.
Yeah.
Here are the three of you. These are Tomasz's three children.
Yeah.
Your sister
steady decline as it goes across.
Sorry?
Yeah. Steady decline. Yeah.
Why?
But he. But Shimon. When I showed Simon this book from the Czech Republic, written in Czech, published, and I said, "Look, I've got you this." He did a complete double take, and he looked at it and he said, "Where do you get this? Where do you get this?" You know, because our name, having a single L, is very rare. And there it was, Shimon with the cedilla or whatever, written as a printed book. So he was absolutely amazed.
I can see, looking at the time that we're running behind schedule, because we need to move on to talk about the book Sancta Familia, which was written by your father and your uncle in 1938. I shall put it up on the screen. This is a remarkable book, isn't it? Because it's Tomáš and Martin in 1938, living in Prague 7 in the flat that we saw a minute ago, writing these scenes from their daily life. It must have been amazing for you to suddenly be sort of drawn into the daily life of a Prague family, of your own Prague family at that time.
Yes, it is an amazing little book in that it's just everyday language, you know, everyday activities, and just almost like very, very ordinary good life. But what he the way it's written and the way that it's illustrated is just a fantastic little book.
Yeah.
But it's just been published by Triada in a trilingual edition, because they wrote it in this wonderfully quirky mixture of Czech and German. And we've just brought it out as a trilingual edition. In the Czech Republic, you can buy it in bookshops. In Britain, it's available, well, if you contact the publishers. And I've actually, and there you can see the address, triada@i-triada.net. I've also put together a little collage, again from the podcast that we're just putting together, of extracts from Ubernatu, not from Ubernatu, from Sancta Familia. So it'll give you a flavor of this book.
At some point, every sentence in this book has been spoken. That was our aim, to capture the little oddities of each of us and preserve them for all time. The little quirks. To set down every typical expression was quite impossible, because new ones are constantly appearing and old ones disappearing.
We become a fly on the wall in the daily life of the family. Ida leaves. Martin sits at the table as if he has something important to do. His father appears.
Time for bed.
In a minute.
Not in a minute, now. What if Mum were to come back?
She'd go on the rampage.
Exactly. So off you go.
But first of all, I'll show you who's in charge, Dad. A ferocious battle follows, raging for some time the length and breadth of the flat. Dad desperately tries to defend himself, while Martin tries every possible means of attack. Given the chance, he can be very brave. But he's as quick as a fox as soon as Dad tries tickling him with one finger, poking him in the back, or trying out some other fatherly trick. When Dad outsmarts him, he cries out like a banderlog. At last, Dad gets him into the bathroom, but Martin does not stay there long. He's heading for bed.
In die Corona willst du gehen, du Lauser? Komm, geh mal.
Mom, speak Czech. We're in the Corona now. You can't speak German here.
What will you have, Martin? A meatball?
You bet. Get yourself one too, Mom.
No, I really shouldn't. Here is a crown.
I push my way through the crowd and return with a meatball. Hey, Mom, look how much onion she gave me. Have a bite.
No, I'd better not.
Then all you see is a row of fine teeth, which carefully and cleanly bite off a piece of that fatty meatball. Did you like it, Mum?
Ja, lecker.
Good morning, Mr. Wels. An amazing thing came to my mind during the night. Sit down. Just look. If these countries were all to join forces and if Russia were to arm herself properly, then Germany couldn't move a muscle. What do you think?
Yes, that would be nice.
Wouldn't it? That's what should be done. And you know when it came to me? At 3:15 in the morning. Isn't it wonderful?
That's a sort of flavour of the book. You'll notice there was some slight, those of you who speak Czech and German will notice there's some slight changes that we made. The book is written with different names, but we put back, when we made the podcast, we gave the members of the family back their original, their own names. I mean, the illustrations are by the 13-year-old Martin. He was remarkably gifted. He was already going to art classes there in Prague at the well-known Oficina Pragensis art school. Ivan, you're an artist in yourself. I mean, it must have been wonderful sort of seeing the work of your uncle, and presumably something of that has gone through to you.
Well, I think that's probably true, in a sort of like an osmosis, really, because it was around. And for years, as a young child, I said I wanted to be an architect. And that went on until I went to an architect's office and saw how boring it could be. At that time, I'd taken an interest in oil painting. And so I went to art school and eventually ended up as an art teacher. But I can't help feeling that having this in the background, it's like parents having books on the shelves and the children actually sort of taking up the influence. Yeah, and it was always there. Could I just say how fantastic that was, that the way you produced that as well with the music background? It's amazing like that, brings it to life.
It's been good fun putting that together, actually. I was wondering about the humor as well. Do you recognize, I mean, because your father co-wrote the book, do you recognize some of your dad's humor in that?
I don't know, Colin, you'd be really best off. We wouldn't say that our father was a sort of a humorous sort of fellow. He was more dry,
He wasn't really very jokey.
No.
But he always made these kind of word plays, and they're always called Tom's jokes.
Yeah, Tom joke.
Yeah.
Bad joke. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I say when we're talking about Sancta Familia, that I'm so impressed with the translation that's been done in the book and the book that's being produced. It's absolutely fantastic.
And the exhibition as well, David, is just amazing. After all these years, here I am now, 76, and I'm looking at this as if I'm seeing it for the first time. It is absolutely amazing.
We're hoping to get the exhibition to London as soon as nothing much we can do at the moment, but before long, hopefully. And I'd also like to invite Bettina KAIBACH from the University of Heidelberg to join us. Hello, Bettina. The reason why Bettina is here is because we worked together, and it was great fun on putting this book, bringing this book out. Because we've decided to bring it out as a full trilingual edition. It jumps between languages in the original, and there are all sorts of pictures in it as well. Bettina, what were your? I know that when you first saw the manuscript, you were a bit disappointed, but then you changed your mind, didn't you?
I was disappointed at first. I have to say that I underestimated the book, but now I would say it's really, as you said before, it's absolutely remarkable. And I have to say that I'm very moved when I see the photographs of Martin, who's, I think, the main author of that little book. It's very moving to see him after having worked with this book for so many weeks. At first, I thought this was mostly about paying tribute to the memory of this boy and the family, which in itself, of course, is a worthy enterprise. But I didn't sort of really see that the book itself would be of any interest beyond that. But the more I got into it, the more did I find that there are many layers that you maybe don't see at first sight.
Yes.
And what struck me most, and what I think is really remarkable, is that beneath that family idol that the boy very much tries to preserve, and all the very childlike, playful incidents, there's an overall sense of menace that you feel in many little details, and you may miss them when you first read the book. And I think, let me give an example for when they go to this restaurant in the bit of the podcast that you showed, and they're having this meatball. Right afterwards, they meet a woman on the street in Prague, and the adults talk about emigration, but it's really just small talk, and you realize how prevalent this topic has become. So the acquaintance they meet on the street, she says, yeah, everybody's talking about immigration. And she cracks a joke saying, seasick is what we'd like to be now, because they all want to be on a ship to the United States, presumably. And the mother says, yes, my oldest one has already left, and we're going to follow. We're already selling the furniture. And I think the fact that all of this is sort of conveyed through the perspective of a child who doesn't, to some degree, not really understand what's going on or how grave this is, but on the other hand, I think has a very acute sense of what's going on around him. I think that makes this book also very important. And I would say it would probably good to use it for teaching children also about this particular phase, you know, before the Holocaust had actually started, but people were already feeling threatened. They knew that their lives as they knew it were going to be shattered quite soon. They would not be able to preserve it. So that I found very impressive. And then it's been said before, but the characters in this book are just immensely likable. So when you read it, you do feel that you're part of this family, and you grow to like the people. There's a lot of warmth and love in the book. There's an enormous sense of humor on the part of this 13-year-old boy. So it was a pleasure reading it. It was a pleasure working with it. And I'm very happy to see it in print now.
It was a lovely linguistic exercise, wasn't it? Working between the three, in fact, there are 4 languages, because there's a little bit in French as well. That was fun, wasn't it? And finding the right tone, and whether to translate Martin's slightly pompous German into standard English, or whether to try and get across something of his attempt to sort of sound a little bit older than he is. There were all sorts of little challenges like that, weren't there?
Yeah, it was also much more complex than I first thought it would be. I mean, I thought I would work on this for 1 or 2 days, and it grew into this major thing that took me weeks to finish. So, and I think it was a huge challenge also for the translators, meaning you and Katrin and Michaela, because the language, I mean, there are 4 different languages in the book. There's German and Czech, then there is English, and it's sometimes it's a faulty English, and also funny sometimes, because the mother of the narrator uses an archaic English. So when she blames him for not having done his homework, she says something like, "Thou hast not done your homework," or something like that. So you have these archaic forms. I found it remarkable to see the ease with which the family switches between German and Czech. I think this is also interesting historically. They're totally bilingual, but there's also a grim political backdrop to it at this point, because as you mentioned, or as is mentioned in the podcast, they know by now that it's not opportune to use German in specific contexts. And also the fact that the boy studies English. There's one passage where he talks to his English teacher, is not so harmless when you look at it, because they're getting ready to leave the country. So learning English is a way to survive in a new environment. So that there's this kind of grim backdrop to almost everything in the book, although it's very serene on the surface, and that I found interesting.
Worth pointing out, isn't it? It's worth pointing out that the book was written exactly in the middle between the Munich Agreement, which gave Germany huge chunks of Czechoslovakia, and that's actually why the grandmother is living with the family, because she had to flee from Cheb, from Eger, and then 3 months later, then the occupation began. So it's right in the middle between these 2 events. And in fact, in the book, Tomáš has already left, which is actually predicting his leaving in the future, because at the time he was still at home. So it's interesting in that respect that they predict that he's going to go away first, which he actually did, but under very different circumstances.
Yeah,
yes.
I think that's important. The book starts with his leaving. So the issue of emigration, of having to leave, is there right from the start. And I also thought it was interesting that the boy, Martin, uses this as an excuse for not doing his homework. So he tells the English teacher, you know, I saw off my brother to the train station today, which is why I couldn't do my homework, and the English teacher, of course, thinks this is an appropriate reason for not doing it. So there's still this lightness to it. It's still, it seems very harmless. But when we know what happened, of course, it, you know, adds a different perspective to the whole book.
I wish we could go on for much longer.
I'm glad that you know, our friend has brought this up, because this is the enormous tragedy that this boy of such enormous talent, and his father of such enormous talent, ended up in Terezin and at the family camp in Auschwitz. And in Auschwitz, along with what I see as the cream of Czech society at that time, with composers, with architects, with doctors, in 1944.
But I can say at this point, David, about I didn't feel what it must have been like until I saw a film called Woman in Gold, which is a fairly recent film, because that's set in Vienna, a lot of it, and this is in Prague, but they're more or less the same sort of architecture and atmosphere as well, with all these composers and conductors and writers around. It was quite a sort of an artistic circle. But in that, there's a scene at the end when she leaves, when the Helen Mirren character leaves and escapes with the last flight to leave Vienna. And I think, just think of Tom, what it must have been like at that time to have left his family. It must have been terrible, because he must have had doubts about whether he would see them again.
And I think it explains as well why he didn't talk to you.
Yeah, trauma.
When he started a new life, it must have been such a trauma. We need to move on to make space for, I'm sure there are lots of questions and comments from people who've joined us all over Europe, all over the world. And so I'd like to pass over to Monica again, who has been gathering your questions and comments. Monica.
Yes, with pleasure. Well, I'm aware that time indeed has rolled on. David, at the beginning, I remember of our conversations, he said, oh, it'll all fit into an hour or so. And I knew full well that it couldn't possibly, and I'm very glad that it didn't. Nevertheless, if people have to leave, of course, you must feel free to do so. Equally, there are a number of questions which I think are important to put to you. Did your father, Ivan and Colin, ever talk to your mother more than he did to you guys, to his children?
Don't know the answer to that.
Interesting. No.
I remember that she did have some very garbled versions of the family history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Because when I asked Colin questions about it, he gave the most odd answers sometimes. That just can't be true. You know, based on what I'd learnt from the box, and so she had she listened with half an ear sometimes, I think, to what Tom told her.
I think actually she did know a lot more than we did, because when we went through the photos later on, she could identify all the people in the photos. So I think he must have talked much more to her. Maybe he was trying to save us children from learning about it. I don't know what his motivation for keeping quiet about his past was.
There is, of course, more than one question precisely asking that, you know, what are the reasons in your view for his silence? And I think in a way you've already answered that. And of course, this is a very, very common phenomenon, the kind of protective silence that both protects the man, the woman who went through it, but also the descendants.
Yeah, the effect of trauma. You don't want to traumatize other people, but you don't want to relive the trauma yourself.
Absolutely.
And I think that's right.
And there's also an element of having moved on. He felt that he'd moved on. I mean, he'd made a big success in this country. He came over with nothing. I could hardly speak English. And he built it up through sheer hard work. That's obviously something he picked up from his father, Rudolf, and others, you know, that hard work gets you somewhere. And that was always a sort of background to it. So he went from nothing to becoming an engineer, an executive with Consolidated African Selection Trust mining company. So, you know, he built it all up from that. So he probably felt that it was history and we weren't all that interested in it. Now, of course, I wish I'd talked to him more.
That's such a common refrain. I mean, I don't want to diminish in any way the uniqueness of your family story, but, you know, I wish I thought to ask when it was possible to do so. Absolutely. Another related question. Were you at least aware that your father's family was Jewish as you were growing up?
Yes.
Yes. Yes?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what about the story of how he got to this country? Could you, I think we've had several questions. Curious, you know, people curious to know more detail.
Interesting that we had just little scraps that he got out. There was no sort of detail about how he did it or who helped him or whatever. So there's just little scraps. I mean,
did you find out more as a result of what you discovered in the box?
Yeah.
No,
I did. Yeah.
Well, there's that. This is the thing that what Colin is holding up is the story, isn't it? That tells the whole story of how he got out.
Well,
give it to us in a nutshell if you're able to.
Okay. In 1942, when he was in Swansea University, he wrote for this magazine called Dawn, and gave precise detail of what actually happened. He went to, he was, the organization that helped people escape, because the Nazis were at that time in Czechoslovakia, but they weren't in Poland. And the organization took him up to the border with Poland, and somebody from Poland took him across the border, and he stayed with somebody there. It was, in the articles, they're all about danger to his life. Of course, they kept seeing Germans, and they knew they'd be shot if they were discovered. Never knew that it was quite like this. We knew he had escaped, but didn't know that he was in severe danger. And in fact, he was extremely lucky to have done it. Amazing story.
About that article is that he deliberately writes about somebody called Ian, and he signs the article Bert, which I think is rather.
Right.
Well, his middle name is Albert, so he.
But he was obviously covering. He was also covering for people who might have been identified at that time.
And this all happened in April 1939, so it was after Czechoslovakia was occupied and before Poland was occupied. So it was this window where you could escape through Poland, and then they took a ship to Dover, and that's that very moving bit at the end of the text where he sort of says, "I arrived in Dover as a refugee, but glad to be a refugee because I was a refugee in a free country." And I think that echoes even in our own time.
He had wanted to take Martin with him, but his parents wouldn't let him.
Oh, yeah. They thought it was unsafe, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
But he was basically the same age as a sixth former when he left. So, I mean, he was very, very young. He did, when he came over to this country, he went to stay with an aunt in Bristol called Ilse. And we're still in touch with her family at the moment, you know, her children and grandchildren and so on. She ran a Steiner school near Bristol. I think that's right, isn't it, Colin? So he had some sort of connection here, and that possibly helped him get to this country when other people couldn't, when other people were refused.
Well, his uncle was here. Otto was here. Otto was in England at the time.
That's another mystery. He never talked about Otto, did he?
He died tragically in 1945, didn't he? He was run over on his bicycle by a car, which is incredibly ironic.
Yep.
Uncle Otto.
We could go on a lot longer. There are lots of interesting questions, but I think perhaps we ought to draw to a close with one last one, which again is directed at Ivan and Colin. An obvious question, but I think an absolutely crucial one. How has this changed you, this discovery? And you say it's not over yet. Clearly it's not over yet, this kind of unfolding, you know, of the different layers, discovering the different layers, infinite layers of your family's complicated and yet in many ways quite typical, archetypal sort of story. How has that changed your sense of who you are? Difficult question, but try answering.
Wonderful. I don't think it's wonderful. I mean, it's, as I say, it's like an archaeology thing, you know, where you're sort of getting layers, and each layer you get down, you think, wow, I didn't know that. And and of course you trace it all back, and every time I see this, David, you know, the exhibition and the various bits and pieces that you've got here, I see something new every time. And as I say, I just wish I'd been a bit more persistent, I think. Yeah, but as you say, Monica, you know, we all feel like that about our parents, I think. So, you know, but I wish he'd been more forthcoming. He wasn't really. My mother was the vocal one in the family. My mother had all the projects and everything. I don't think that's wrong, is it, Colin? And therefore he sort of took a back step, partly because he was always very busy, you know. Always.
Did he have an accent?
Oh, very strong.
Somebody said, "Is your father English?" And I said, "Yes." Well, what's his accent then? Well, I never heard it. As I said before, you know, to us he was dad, just our father, and a rather annoying father as well, rather sort of critical sort of father. I think that he didn't see these things objectively. That's one of the best things, Monica, about looking back, is that you sort of see things and think, wow, I didn't know that. You put it into some sort of perspective.
There is one thing I would like to ask you both, is also that you've, with the family with whom all the stuff was preserved, the Stifter family in Prague, it's thanks to them that we have this whole story. And it's rather moving that you've kind of re-established a friendship with the daughter, who's sadly no longer with us, and with the grandchildren of Josef Stifter, the Protestant pastor, thanks to whom the things were preserved. Could you maybe say a couple of words about that as well? Because it's a kind of a very fragile, sort of tentative bridge, isn't it? It's sort of being rebuilt between your life in Britain and in Czechoslovakia.
I wouldn't call it tentative. We're very good friends now, and we correspond with them quite a lot. So yeah, in fact,
I didn't know anything about that. Did you, Colin? I didn't know about the Stifters at all.
No, no, I didn't. I didn't know how the connection was actually made. Was that you, Jerry?
It was I think.
Who? Pardon? I don't know how it happened now.
I know how it happened. It's a complicated story, but it was
Michal Rund.
It was. Now we have it. Now we have Marta, who is Josef Stifter's granddaughter.
Ask Marta to tell us.
Let Marta tell us.
Yes, I think it was through Michal Rund who organized your trip to Sokolov, and then he invited you to my mother's flat, and there was Jerry and you both, and that was our first meeting.
Marta, would you like to turn on your camera so that we can see you?
Yes. Turn on your camera.
Don't feel obliged, but if you'd like to.
Yes.
Lovely.
Oh, hello. Hello there. Hi.
Hello.
I'm Pavel.
Nice to meet you all.
But how did Michael know about you, Marta?
It's a long story.
Right.
Once I heard in the broadcast in the radio the program of Zdeněk Lukeš, the architect who explained his experiences with Šimon Wels's book Ubernatu. And he was so excited about it. And I was a long time hesitating whether to telephone him or not, because of course we knew about Wels family. But in the end I did it, and through him we met Michal Rund, and through Michal Rund we met you.
I can remember when we first saw Lydia, and we were all round at the flat in there, and Lydia's look as if she kept on staring at me, almost through me.
Yes.
Because it's almost as if she thought she'd seen a ghost. Because I'd just stared and just shaking her head. And I can see now, you know, when how old she was when she last saw Tom. You know, how she's trying to recall what it was like at the time, particularly in that photograph, which I think is a brilliant photograph of the Stifter family all around that table.
Well, probably because you recalled seeing your grandfather, who's probably at that age would be more like you. Actually.
Yeah, Ivan, you do look like Rudolph. It has to be said, you look like Rudolph.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
I'm honoured.
David, I hate to break this off. Maybe you can in fact carry on the conversation informally in a family sort of way, allowing everybody else perhaps to leave. I don't know, Renata or Petra, whether that's possible, but I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, all of you, for participating in what's been truly a wonderful event. And actually, just to add to my thanks, 2 lovely comments. There've been lots of lovely comments, of course, but from is it from Renata or from somebody field about her, but yes, just wanted to say how delightful the window is that has been opened. I really appreciate the way the event has been put together, and David, we have you to thank, I think, very much for the beautiful way in which you orchestrated it. A box of wonder, what a lovely way to put it. And then somebody else, yes, somebody called Alex Went. This is not just a fascinating family story, it's also an incredibly moving testimony. Thank you, David and Alia, for your dedicated work. Absolutely. And can I just end by saying that for those of you who would like to listen to it again, or weren't, in fact, who registered but weren't able to be here tonight, and just to spread the word, the event has, of course, been recorded. It will be available on Facebook for quite a, well, I think for forever, sort of more or less forever, but also on the Czech Centre YouTube channel, and also on the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, and you can find easily both of them simply by Googling them. So once more, thank you. It's been wonderful. Thank you very, very much, everybody, for being part of it. All the very best.
Thanks a lot.
Good night.
Thanks, Monica. Good job.